the goal of reducing child poverty about half by 2010 using current policies, even whatever has been introduced today, because there was supposed to be some more innovations today, that goal will not be realised. Well, for me, it should be the centre point of government domestic policy, really. The importance of reducing child poverty is twofold. If you reduce the poverty of large numbers of children, ipso facto, you reduce the poverty of large numbers of adults too, because of the fact that all children live in families or in some sense with adults. Second, child poverty is a relative measure, so the more you reduce it, the more you reduce overall inequality. Myself, I think that we can't simply leave the super rich alone. I think that the government has to look at the possibility of taxing high income earners to support, especially I think, programs against child poverty. So in this book I suggested a form of wealth tax which should be oriented towards the top 0.05% of wealth holders, which would be used to invest in children. I don't see why the super rich shouldn't help the super poor. And so all these things for me would be part of a new concerted effort to have an attack on inequality, one of the areas where New Labour was not nearly as successful as I think it needs to be. And there are other areas where delivery is still poor, including health and education, as we know. But third, what Mr. Brown has to do is to innovate, and here I think he's simply not been as successful so far as I hoped he might be. I thought Mr. Brown would come into power with an articulated view of the future of Britain and with innovative policies to achieve that future. I don't see much sign of them so far. And if I can just give you an example, one example from many, there is a new agenda, I think, out there in politics today, which is not like that traditional welfare state, but sort of overlaps with it, and that is the agenda of lifestyle change. If you look all the way through, from problems of health and illness, through binge drinking, antisocial behaviour, to the kind of big daddy of them all, climate change, they all presume quite fundamental changes in lifestyle habits. The politics of lifestyle is now a very serious part of the modern political domain. But I don't see that Mr. Brown's government, at the moment anyway, has got an overall handle on this. I expected him to come in with much more interesting possible resolutions of these issues. The lifestyle agenda is going to be a really difficult one for us to resolve. But if you look at health and illness, for example, as an illustration of it, when the NHS was set up, most of the killer diseases were infectious diseases. But now nearly all of the killer diseases are lifestyle-related diseases. Whether you're talking about heart disease or lung disease or even cancer, strongly influenced by lifestyle practices that people follow. If you look at the debate over obesity alone, the prevalence of obesity in Scotland and in the rest of the UK will swamp the health service something like 15 to 20 years down the line because of the health implications of this really tremendous change really in people's physical makeup. So I would expect, I mean, in my view, you can get an overall framework for dealing with lifestyle issues, and climate change is, as I said, perhaps at the core of that agenda, really. In the Queen's speech today, there was announced a climate change bill. I hope that Mr. Brown would have radicalised it a bit, because it originally suggested reducing emissions by 60% by 2020, but I think a target of 80% is necessary, since the developed countries should show the rest of the world the way. But you cannot do this simply by pinning your hopes on technology. You have to do it by persuading people somehow to make substantial changes. in their everyday lives. Very happy to discuss it if anyone interested. We do know a lot about the conditions under which people will make changes, but it's the kind of agenda I expected Gordon Brown to say more about than he has so far, and there are a range of other areas like that, really. Well, at the present time, what are the prospects for Labour? As everyone sitting here will know, Gordon Brown made a very good beginning for the first 3 months, in which he was riding high at the polls, and then essentially, I think you have to say, made a series of mistakes, all of them really bound up with the idea that an election might be held. There was the continual deferring of whether or not the election would be held. There was the attempt to claim that not holding an election had nothing to do with the standing of Labour in the polls, which declined after the Tory party conference. That was a mistake, I think. There was Gordon Brown going to Iraq in the middle of the Tory conference, interpreted anyway as a kind of naked gesture to try and draw attention away from the Tories. And then there was the borrowing of Tory policies in the comprehensive spending review. These things have quite substantially damaged Mr. Brown's reputation. I think mainly because Mr. Brown has to stake that reputation on strategic grasp, on depth, and on competence. Mr. Brown is not a charisma-style politician, as we know. He's a politician who claims to be strategically ahead of the game, to look at issues in depth, and to come up with innovative solutions to them. So I think it's perhaps not surprising at the moment that the Tories are now suddenly leapt ahead of Labour. What does this mean for the next 2 years? Well, what it means is the following. I think, first of all, there can't be an election next year. That would, in my view, have been the best time to have an election for Labour in the spring, as a Labour supporter. That's now impossible, I think. It's too close to the period when the election was talked about and then called off. So an election almost certainly won't happen for another 2 years. Over that 2 years, I think Mr. Brown has to produce a kind of slow return to the rebuilding of his reputation. I don't think it's going to be easy, and I think it's going to be an uphill battle. However, I think Labour still does have a decent chance of winning the next election. The reason being that if you look at the polls, you look at surveys, people are not yet convinced by the Tories, and not yet convinced by David Cameron's performance as a leader. David Cameron made a big impression with the speech he gave at the Tory conference, but it wasn't reflected in a big jump in people's estimation of him as a reliable Prime Minister. So I think you've got two leaders, both a bit untried in the eyes of the average voter. That's why I think it's still a bit all to play for in British politics, and that's why I think as a Labour supporter it's certainly not impossible that Labour could win a fourth term under Mr. Brown's leadership. Well, just in conclusion, going back to jokes and lifestyle, I might as well try another joke on you and then sort of finish for discussion. You know, lifestyle change is very important, so there's a lot of studies going on about how diet and other things affect how long people live and their health. So these American researchers, right, they go down to study people living in the deep south of the US, and they see this wizened guy, all wrinkled, rocking him backwards and forwards contentedly on his porch, and they say to him, well, what did you eat how do you live to get yourself in such a position? And he said, oh, well, I smoke 60 cigarettes a day. I don't bother what I eat, I just eat junk food. I never take any exercise. And they say, God, that's amazing, how old are you? And he says, 35. Well, thank you very much.